It's so great to see you again, Michael.
Yeah, great to see you.
Welcome to October 2020.
It's been a while.
It has been a while, yeah. As you know, I've been kind of on the ropes for a while due to some surgery, but I'm up and running again. And I'm very excited today to talk with you about just the general concept of what 2020 means and how it has affected us. And also another idea that I'm rolling around in my head on the difference between constraint satisfaction and optimization. So we'll hit the road running. I'm going to ask you to tell me what you think is so interesting about 2020.
Yeah, well, we were just chatting about this briefly before we turned on the record, but I think, I mean, for myself, I find there seems to be a very heavy dreamlike element in everything we're experiencing this year, given that so much of the consequential aspects of our lives, whether you're talking about the news coming from the COVID situation itself, or things in the political sphere, or some of the stuff with the George Floyd and all of what came out of that. All of it comes to us through like these digital screens, and it's kind of in this distilled, filtered form, these sort of icons and symbols that get passed to us, and then we have to reimagine them and put them into some sort of context. And not that we're not always doing that, but it's so much more of our connection to the outside world now comes to that. We don't have as you were pointing out, this sort of in-person interactions quite as frequently, that give us a sense of, I think, of feeling more grounded and certain, and a sort of comfort in knowing that somebody else kind of sees or is in the same place with us at the same time. A certain togetherness and communion is kind of withheld from us within all this. And so one of the things that I experience, whenever I'm interacting with things that have this sort of dreamlike quality, is there's this amorphous quality to all of it, and in a certain sense that it's I can't quite be certain that anything actually happened, or that even if it did happen, that it happened in the way I'm recollecting it now. There's this sort of emotional disconnect from it that's really kind of profound. And I don't know if anybody else is experiencing it that way, but that's kind of what my 2020 has been like. And
I wonder if part of that, and maybe this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but I do feel like there are ways in which we get gaslighted all the time on things where you hear something and you think it's true, and then you're thinking about that thing being true, and you're building your picture of what's happening in the world based on that thing that you heard. And then someone else shows you some evidence, no, that's absolutely not true. And so then you think, oh, well, then I must be wrong. And so then you go back and look for the evidence on the other side, and there's perfectly good evidence on the other side. And so we're kind of stuck in this in between. And because we're not having grounding relationships with people on a daily basis that remind us that we are all human beings, we're all in this together, we're a family, so to speak. We're not having those kinds of relationships. And so all we have is information. And when all you have is information, you really don't have anything. Because there's a big difference between information and truth, or between information and facts. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely feel this thing where I've had to kind of, I was a theater major in college, and so one of the things they talk about is the suspension of disbelief. When you're sitting in the audience, you have to suspend disbelief so that you can watch the thing play out on the stage or on the screen, and you can identify with the characters, and you can make some sense out of what the story is. I tend to get too wrapped up in the characters. And so last night we were watching an episode of The Mentalist, and I got so wrapped up in the characters. I'm like, I can't even watch this anymore. It's just too tense. And I can't let life become that way, because if I let life become that way, then I'm just a knot. I'm just balled up with tension all the time. So I tend to let life just play out on this screen and try to hold a suspension of disbelief and try to navigate and listen to as much of the information coming in and try to make sense of it through the filter that I have. But there's something about this year particularly that makes that super difficult.
Yeah. It's really difficult. And what you were talking about there with, in terms of like, not knowing what's real, and like you get some piece of information and then you find that that's only one side of the story and there's this complete other side to it. I feel like in some sense that's probably been going on forever, but it does feel particularly severe this year. And I'm not sure what it is that is pulling the strings there. I do think some aspect of it is definitely being moved forward by social media and the ways in which things go viral and become picked up. Like the way you get attention is by subtly nudging the narrative of whatever it is you're expressing in a very particular direction, to manifest either to this audience or that audience the things that are going to get them to click or engage or listen longer, or whatever metric it is that gets you like a few extra pennies as a content producer. That's those algorithms drive what we actually look at and interact with on a daily basis. I think that's definitely a big part of it. So even now when I'm listening to things that historically, I would think, okay, this is more of a trusted source. This is somebody I trust to kind of filter through that kind of, I don't know, that sort of malaise of disinformation that we've all just become. Everybody assumes it. It doesn't matter who you are nowadays. You assume it, but then you have different tags for who you think it's the disinformation is coming from versus who's the trusted. Like you could like reverse those for different people. But now, even when I'm listening to people that I ordinarily would trust, I have this thing in the back of my mind going, I don't know if I trust them either, because I feel like they're also captured by this whole process as well, and they're also trying. And even like, if a particular item comes from a source of information that I don't trust, I have the reaction of assuming it's automatically wrong. And then I'm like, well, that's not really healthy either, because there's probably some aspect of it that's true.
Yep.
And so like, but it's it's sort of a reflexive action to try and fend off information from here and like get to the source of truth. It just is, I don't know, something's breaking down in all this.
Well, because we have an absolute assurance right now that any information that we get has an agenda. We're not just getting information. Every bit of information that we get has been tailored to an agenda.
Yeah.
And so you have to try to figure out what is the agenda of that person, and then try to just filter out the information, and then take the information and try to take the information from all sides and put it through a different filter.
Yeah.
And then every once in a while you run into somebody who has a completely unique agenda, like let's say Chloe Valdery. She has this agenda that everything needs to run through a filter of love,
Mm-hmm.
which I mean, I really like. I like her ideas. I like I like her program that she sells. She's trying to do a training program for people on this whole agenda of love. But then every once in a while, even she will get political sometimes. And when she gets political, the agenda of love just flies right out the window.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so I mean, all of the people that we want to admire have just fallen into this trap of this political vitriol on both sides, and nobody's looking for the truth anymore. And as you said, it seems particularly worse this year. And I think,
well, I think most people, in some sense, we still have at our core, we still have a desire. Everybody has a desire for truth. Nobody wants, as a basic mode of who you are, nobody wants to be deceived, right? Like even if you hope for and wished for other people to be deceived, you still hope for some sort of actual discernment of what reality is, because reality has, if you know that if you're too far out of touch with reality, there's bad consequences that come from that.
do you think
There's
everybody
things.
knows that?
I think so. I don't know if everybody would articulate it as such. And I think this is something we often don't realize, the ways in which, when we engage in deception, we often do deceive ourselves first, because there is a sort of arrogance there in terms of believing that we can twist the fabric of reality, and that we'll know the real version, and that other people will only be affected by the deception we're foisting on the world, which I really think is absolutely not true. I think that's a big part of what I think Peterson's trying to explain in a lot of his work when he talks about telling the truth, is the ways in which, at a very deep biological level, these sort of twistings that we do make their way into the patterns that are us. If we are patterns, seeing patterns, it's very, very dangerous to do any sort of twisting, especially voluntarily twisting the truth, because there's all kinds of twisting that happens without our meaning to, whether it's coming voluntarily from other people, or just kind of this sort of the fact that we're finite and we're trying to process more information than we possibly can, which leads to all sorts of errors and misunderstandings, etc. You have a lot of that noise already. Introducing noise voluntarily into the equation is just kind of sheer stupidity, although we don't recognize it as such. And often,
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole point. It is sheer stupidity, but we don't recognize it. And so I think we fall into the trap so easily. And I mean, one of the ways you see this so clearly right now is the projection that goes on. Because if I allow something in me to get twisted to where I'm deceiving myself, then I don't recognize where the twist is in me. So when I look at other people, I see the twist over there, and then I can accuse them.
Yep.
But basically what I'm doing is projecting my own deceit onto other people. And I see that happening everywhere right now. I mean, the people who are guilty of a particular thing are telling us that all of their enemies are guilty of that thing. You know what I mean? And
well, it's the old kid line. It takes one to know one, right? It's really true, because it wouldn't be so irksome. It wouldn't be so easy to identify if it wasn't something already you knew existed in yourself and were somewhat ashamed of, or had some sort of some keen apprehension of, this should not be. And I mean, I remember hearing a pastor do a kind of example of this, and she was saying, let's say someone's being boastful, and you think to yourself, no, what you're really thinking sometimes when you're irritated by them boasting is, you're saying, okay, no, you don't do it that way. You do it secretly in your heart of hearts. You boast to yourself inside. You don't do it openly like that. But really, the reason they're boasting causes pain and suffering to us is because we'd really like to be doing the same thing. And I think there is really a lot of truth in that. Because oftentimes, and here's how you can tell if it's really all about you, is whether you really have real concern over how that person's being negatively affected by what's occurring, how much sympathy you have for the negative effects of their own poor decisions on them versus on you. And it is weird how readily we are able to come up with excuses for ourselves and not other people, for why they might be doing the sorts of things that they're doing. This is always kind of mysterious to me. Um, and yeah, I find myself doing it myself when especially when the rubber meets the road, and you get into some sort of conflict. The other person's bad and you're 100% good. Um,
Well, and I think a lot of that goes to this whole idea of one of the things about social media is that all of the memes and all of the ideas that get thrown around are very, very low resolution, right? But even though they are low resolution, they carry within them kind of a zip bomb, because that meme, depending on who uses it, can be read in a multitude of different ways by the people
yeah,
who receive it. And it can be highly destructive, but it's very low resolution because the meme doesn't really carry in itself valid information or sufficient information, but the person receiving it is hearing a whole symphony in their head when they read the meme. I mean, I notice that I'll see some meme and I'll just like instantly get it because it fills up my filter in a way that it tells a story to me. But I have no idea if that's the same story that was intended by the person that made up the meme in the first place.
yeah,
It has a tremendous emotional impact on me, though. You know, sometimes it makes me sarcastic, snarky, you know, like, yeah, I get it, you know, and I'm one of the in guys. Or it can frustrate me because I think, oh, here's this simplistic meme, and in order to counter it, I'd have to write a 15-page document explaining what all the information actually is, you know. So it's really a bad way to communicate, but it's the only way that we communicate anymore at all.
yeah. I was yesterday. I was rewatching an old conversation between Paul and John Vervaeke, where they were talking about Paul was presenting the idea that perhaps God is an ancient solution to the frame problem. Are you familiar with the frame problem and
Yes.
Vervaeke's whole relevance realization and all that?
Mm-hmm.
So that, I mean, the frame problem essentially is just all about, when you're going to solve any particular problem, you have to pick some sort of locus of what am I going to choose as relevant for this context and what's outside the scope. And and this isn't something we really think about much because it's almost entirely subconscious. A lot of the ways in which we do this, it just kind of is, you know, it just kind of is obvious to me when I walk to my front door that I open it by turning the knob and all that, because there's all this, there's deep, deep knowledge about the world that I live in that's built into me as a biological creature that helps me do all this all the time, and in this sort of unthinking sort of way. And when you were just talking about how Chloe, and she proclaims that, I want everything to come through this filter of love, but then in certain circumstances it's not convenient for the task at hand, and so that filter gets discarded for something that's a little bit more, let's say, I don't know, a little bit more mercenary or easier to get from point A to point B faster within that terrain. But that made me think about, that's one way of measuring the extent to which whether our conception of God is what we say it is in terms of this. And again, the Christian conception of God is this very high conception of both the ground of all being, so something that's that's in like that is permeating the whole of what we would think of as quote unquote physical reality, that permeates that through and through, and yet is utterly beyond it. So it is this sort of deafening combination of transcendence and immanence together, which is what we proclaim is the Orthodox version of God. And I think in Chloe, and maybe is reaching for something sort of high concept like that in her conception of love, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, it fails that test because it doesn't become her filter in many different contexts, right? She bandits it in a certain context, and I think this is what modernity has really brought upon us. This sort of either or mentality, where when I'm in this frame, these are the rules that govern, and when I'm in these frames, these other completely different set of rules become more, I guess, more what am I grasping for here? Just easier or more useful for getting the job done. And so I think this is where the church has maybe really gotten caught up in that same movement, in terms of our too easily we've been shuttled into those sort of pat answers of who God is, these kind of overly simplistic versions of God that don't have the capacity to be that ancient solution to the frame problem that is relevant in every time and place and every problem that you're looking at, and trying to weave your way from what is the right thing to do, what is the wise way to walk this path, where God becomes that symbolic, what is it that Paul always says, the symbolic, imaginative, liturgical, dramatic symbol, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is still there, present and relevant in that space. And I think this is what we've lost, is because, I've this is something I've noticed about myself, is that I'm often, in switching from context to context, I'm coming up on some new idol that is the dominant force at play in this little space. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't have this sort of, and I've been reading through, because I have this app that takes me through the daily office, which is like the Anglican daily biblical readings. And that's going through like Chronicles and Kings right now for the Old Testament portion. And it's always the case that there's like, okay, so-and-so did right in the eyes of the Lord, but he didn't tear down these high places over here. And it always leads to this huge problem. It's like, whether it's, a full chapter or a few paragraphs that detail this guy's reign, it's going to, something poorly is going to result from that. And this sort of, and this is what Paul was talking about in his conversation with Vervaeke, is how God is this, he is this sort of ever evolving symbol that is always tearing down whatever it is that's become the idol in the current frame. Because as soon as I pick something within my frame that I'm using as the kind of point on the hierarchy that I'm filtering things through, it already becomes dead and ossifying from that point. Like I've already locked something in that allows me no longer to evolve and see clearly, because I'm now locked within this finite perspective. Whereas the worship of the true God, let's say, is always this kind of looking to this point that is so high that it is beyond the current frame, and it's always, which is always giving us an opportunity to see afresh.
Well, I love the picture that Chris Wilson used. I don't know if you ever saw his interview with Paul, but Chris Wilson used, and he's a mathematician, he used the picture of the asymptote,
right,
because it's always upward, always inward, always drawing closer, but can never, ever, ever, ever reach. So there's always a place to reach for, there's always a place to strive for, but you're not going to get locked in, you're not going to get frozen. And when you're talking about the frame problem, I remembered a video I was watching of Jordan Peterson yesterday, a short one, where he was talking about animations. He was using animations as an example of accomplishing something, doing a kind of artwork, or he just used it as an example for a lot of different categories. And he said and he uses an example, let's say Disney, when they're going to do an animation, what is their goal? What are they using as their frame? And because Disney's goal is to create a masterpiece, and because an animation means that every single one of the multitude of millions of decisions that have to be made to create an animation, every single thing that's in every frame is a decision, and every frame is a decision, and how the frame is going to be positioned is a decision, and what's going to be in it, and every single thing is a decision. I understood that because when you're doing a painting, certain kinds of paintings you can do can be very random, and you can let happy things happen, and oh, isn't that neat? But other kinds of paintings you do, every single thing you do is a decision. And when there's all these decisions that have to be made, you have to have some sort of a goal that orients you in all that decision making. So when they're doing an animation, if their goal is to create a masterpiece, then every single decision goes through that filter. And that's what it means to have God as the orientation of your frame problem, is that he is above and beyond all, right? So every decision that you make, if you let it be exposed to the light of his glory, then it's, and this is something that's so hard for me to hold on to. Like you were talking about, all these idols that pop up in us that we let take the place of him. And even in recovering from this surgery, I have this dream of being the kind of person who would recover from surgery by reading the scriptures and praying. And no, I'm sitting there just trying to block out the pain, watching some stupid sitcoms. I don't even like them, but it's something that makes my mind go somewhere else. Well, that is like the most foolish thing in the world, and yet I let myself fall into it time and time and time again. And then I'm unhappy with myself. And but if I made those decisions through the filter of who do I really want to spend time with? If I'm in pain, who's really going to be there for me? There's nobody who understands me and my pain as well as God does. So let me submit it to him and ask him for help. So at our Bible study on Sunday night, the most amazing thing happened. I was talking about this struggle that I was having, and one of the women who had just gone through a very extended 6-month illness, very painful illness, and she's a very new believer. And she said, oh, when I was going through my illness, I was in so much pain, and all I could do was just leave myself in the arms of Jesus and say, Jesus, help me through this pain. And she said, what happened was I began to see ways in which my behavior was hurting my family and was hurting my marriage. I mean, like, what kind of, so amazing that she could get that out of that, right? That instead of the focus being on her pain, she let Jesus minister to her and teach her. And after she came through that and got better, and she put into place these things that Jesus taught her about her behavior, her marriage turned around, her family turned around, and everything is better. So it's not only she's physically better, but all these other things in her life are better because she had her focus on the right orientation in the frame, So that really encouraged me this week to just change my focus.
Yeah. That's really interesting because I was thinking this in the beginning of our conversation, but what you said just brought it up again, is there's this certain leveling aspect to the nature of reality, in terms of like, yes, it's good to be wise and know things, but it also that also can be a hindrance in a lot of ways as well. And it's great to be smart. It's great to have like a gift of an intellect, but that can be warped in a million ways as well if you let it go astray. It's a little bit more to manage, and there's you have that many more mental tricks you can play with yourself to deceive yourself, with a greater intellect. And so there's this great leveling aspect to all levels of reality, like where, yeah, you say, okay, I'd rather be over here, but it's like, yeah, but there's always this pros and cons that you get with it. So in the situation like you're describing, where somebody doesn't have a certain a certain sense of how things should be, and so they're kind of like, I don't know what else to do but to ask God for help. And that in its own way can be it can be a helpful push that you need into seeing the world a different way. um and I mean, for me, like, this whole year has been something of that as well, which I've at times been better about embracing, but most of the time I'm just kind of like kicking and screaming, and like I'd rather not be pushed out of what I feel is comfortable and easy. And yet again, if you would ask me, okay, what's your goals for this year, it's not to stay in the same place, it's to move forward. And so I often do find that when I'm so deeply reluctant to move forward in some ways, there's things in myself that are being pushed at with the fingers of God, to change. And they're things that I've asked him to help me change, right? So,
Mhm.
um, but it is so hard sometimes to experience God's grace, even though I'm, and this is part of the conversation I had with Dr. DeFusha, and that there this sharp divide that we have between what is nature and what is grace, or supernatural, or from coming from God, doesn't really exist. That all of reality is pervaded with this, and what really has changed is our ability to perceive it as such. And so all these opportunities for me, where we do have these, where I've had these challenges this year, they do ultimately become opportunities to see this grace in action. um, and it's something that's really rather simple, ultimately. And yet I do think, and my own experience seems to indicate to me, that perspective of perceiving that that abundance of grace is there all the time. It merely requires me to get into a more humble position, which is, as a kid, I remember I used to always be bothered by the fact that, like, well, why does God, why is he so hung up on having us worship him all the time? This just seems like, if like one of my friend group was like, hey, you need to really worship me. Like, it would just, like, that would just be the most irritating, character flaw of that person that I could never get past. And as a kid, I was always like, well, what's God's deal that he needs us to like boost his ego all the time? But I really don't think that's what worship is about. It's really about us. It's not like, anything about God is being altered significantly by our, you know I don't know, maybe I go back and forth on this. Maybe there are things that are different, but in terms of what our agency produces in the world, and its relationship to God. But really, something changes in us when we get into that worshipful stance, um, where we're now able to see all sorts of gifts and blessings that are right in front of us, that we just couldn't take a hold of them because we couldn't see them
Mhm.
until we're in that moment, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I mean that the experiences that I've had when I've had experiences in worship where like the windows of heaven have opened up and I've had these
Hmm.
visions of those things, it's as though some kind of a channel gets opened. Like it, instead of it being a one-way street, it's like it's now a two-way street, because then I get this infilling of just like this whoosh, like it's just like something's being poured into me at the same time that I'm able to see more, and some sort of massive, I don't know, it's like what's the word you always use about when something very, very complex gets boiled down to into a very small thing and then gets put into you and then it opens up again.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
just
No, I
lost
know,
the
what
word.
you're saying.
I just lost
Now,
the word. But that's what happens, and it's like my heart gets so filled up, and my mind gets so engaged and filled up with all this beauty and possibility and power, and it's like I have a two-way street for a time. But that that doesn't happen if I'm just walking around looking at myself and thinking how great
mhm,
I am. I mean, that never happens then. It only happens when I'm contemplating the greatness of God and his place above and beyond all hierarchies.
yeah. But I mean, just as a peripheral observation, I mean, you don't strike me as a sort of person that goes around having like thinking wonderful things about yourself like all the time, and like letting that get in the way of things. Because the reason I bring that up, because you can also have the opposite problem where your own negative image of yourself is kind of your own focus, which I think that tends to be more my problem, where that it becomes a sort of its own kind of stumbling block of like, okay,
Aren't they
I'm
the same thing? Aren't they the same thing?
I think they are in some sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember I got called up short by one of my Bible study leaders 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. I was saying something to her like, I should know better by now. I should be able to do better than this. I'm,
Yeah.
such a failure. And she said, who do you think you are that you think you should know better? You know?
Huh.
And like, wow, yeah, this whole thing where I start judging myself as not being good enough or not being smart enough or whatever is the same thing as saying I should be good enough and smart enough. It's the
Yeah.
same thing. It's just two sides of the same piece of
Huh.
paper.
What's funny, when you said that, what popped into my head was God in the garden telling Adam and Eve, "Who told you you were naked?" I don't know if that's even
Yeah,
relevant, but
yeah, it is
it
relevant.
is. Um, yeah, there is often a certain arrogance in our conceptions of the world. Um,
Well, when I think of it, it comes down to it, and I'm a very simple thinker, but when it comes down to it, I think the only sin is pride.
uh-huh.
And pride just births a multitude of sins. So pride is the sin. And then out of that, just it's like one of those mother spiders, it just spills out all these little spiders everywhere. Um, and making too little of yourself is the same thing as making too much of yourself. You're looking at yourself. You're
Yeah,
not looking at God, right?
yeah. Well, it's funny. It's yeah. I think you're right in some sense that pride is this kind of cornerstone of all these things. Um, I often find that the animating um, motivation in my own life, and I think that the two are there's a connection between the two is often fear, and because I think part of that fear is is connected to pride, and is this sort of like, okay, what am I really afraid of? I'm afraid of something bad happening to me, because I think, and some of that is a certain desire that what happens to me uh, is decided by me. that it is that the configuration that is me fits this shape that is decided by me, right? Like, and so and an unwillingness to have a sort of a loose grip on that, how I'm perceived, how am I thought of, like what what do the contours of this life of mine look at. And I do think, yeah, I think you're right. I think we have a lot less of the mechanisms in place today to dismantle that, because we got a lot of stuff at our disposal to kind of keep at bay the sorts of things that tend to demonstrate to us how foolhardy that idea is, that we could ever be an individual apart from other things. Like, in some sense, in a deep way, who we are as what a human is this deep set of relationships, both to other people and to creation itself. Um, that if you took away any of them, like, or you can't take away any of them, or you without substantially changing the nature of who that person is. And I do think we've drunk fairly deeply in the modern West at this kind of fount of the myth of the individual, um, and this idea of like choosing for ourselves and freedom, and all these things are very distorted in our minds. Is what I have come to realize lately, and even coming to realize that I still, it's very hard for me to disinfect myself from that, because I've just, I've kind of swallowed a lot of those assumptions.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's why we feel so adrift. But you mentioned fear. I was wondering, did you see the Joe Rogan conversation with Kanye West?
I haven't yet. It's
Very interesting. But at one point, Kanye West is talking about the fear of God. And he said the problem that we're having in today's world is that we no longer teach the fear of God. And when people don't have the fear of God, they fear everything else. When they have the fear of God, they have no fear of anything else.
Yeah.
And I thought that's a really interesting observation. I mean, maybe it's something that's been taught by the church fathers since time immemorial, but it's a very interesting observation, because it's true. When I really have my focus on God and on his greatness and his power and all of that, I have absolutely no fear of death or of ridicule or humiliation or any of those things. But when I take my focus off of God, then I'm like, am I really, accepted in the beloved? Is, maybe I haven't, maybe my belief isn't strong enough or whatever. I mean, I can get all tangled up in all kinds of weird stuff. And then, when you go into surgery and that, there's always a chance you're not going to come out when they put you under anesthesia. You have to start thinking about those things. What is this really all about then? But when my focus is really on the Lord, then I don't have that fear at all. So
Yeah.
I thought it was a really interesting observation. He's quite a guy.
I think
When you listen to him, he goes like this, and you're listening and you're trying to where, and then he'll come back and he'll land it. But sometimes he doesn't land it for an hour, and in the meantime, there's 50,000 other ideas that have crammed into your head that he's put there.
Yeah, what you were just saying, I think is that there is a real insight there. And what it caused me to think of was the ways in which one of the things we're so fearful of is just losing, whether it's ourself or these things that we have, these material things. And what's lost in that perspective is that everything that we have, our very existence, our self-consciousness itself, is given to us as a gift, right? It's not something we asked for. It's not something we really did anything to get. And yet it's been kind of handed to us as a gift. And this ability to kind of conceive of all of creation as a gift, as grace, right? The interaction, the working of God, um, does necessarily lead to that sort of fear, right? Because if this gift has come from God, it now, like, what happens with it, what we do with it, is all going to point back to that source, right? Versus if I believe its source is in me to some extent, of course that's going to make me super fearful about everything, because we're so aware of how fallen and finite and that we're at every moment moving towards death. It's like evident in every aspect of our being. As much as we, in especially the modern West, try to push it from our frame, we're always walking towards death. It's like the one thing we know from the get-go, and have in common with every other human, for the rest of the time. We always know this, and yet we're, and so, yeah, it's, there's something of that fear that needs to be tied in with a recognition of the gift that, we've been given. And, I'm not sure if I tied that together well or not, but I see some intertwining between those concepts.
Well, I did say at the beginning that we were going to talk about constraint, satisfaction, and optimization. And the whole time we've been talking, those two concepts have been kind of at the forefront of my mind. And I think it's very important on all of these issues. And I want to frame it through a picture that I saw on the internet a couple of days ago on Sarah Salviander's Twitter feed. She's a astronomer, astrophysicist, brilliant woman, and her work in astrophysics actually led her to Christ, and so she became a Christian. And so she's always posting these beautiful pictures of the night sky, and there's one of these, pictures of the night sky with the, I don't know, some nebula, and all the galaxies are spinning around and all of that kind of thing. It's just a beautiful picture. And I was looking at it and I was thinking, when the church fathers 2,000 years ago looked into the night sky, they were in awe of God's power. But what they were looking at was a sky filled with stars, and only the stars that they could see. And even that was enough to give them a picture of God's awesomeness and his power and glory and his beauty, and just a display of his majesty. But it was a very, very small portion of what's actually in the night sky, because there's so much that is unseen there, right? But as we have developed better tools and more knowledge, and now we have ways of going farther and getting more highly digitized images, now we know that one of those stars out there is actually a galaxy, and that galaxy opens up into another burst of billions of stars. And so as we've moved through time, the boundaries of our knowledge have expanded, and the boundaries of what is unknown has also expanded, because now we recognize that even with all that we know and all that we can see, there's even more that we don't know that's there. So there's this picture of, let's take the Word of God, which was canonized in 300 AD or something, and think of that as the original night sky that could be seen. There's so much that they thought was known there, and even that was enough to show them the greatness of God. But now we have 2,000 years of history and of individuals filled with the Holy Spirit interacting with God's word and interacting with each other and studying God's word and getting deeper and deeper into the complexities of it. And now the glory and beauty and majesty that's on display in God's word is even more evidence of his power and majesty is available to us through what we now know of his word. Even though his word has not changed and the meaning of his word has not changed, our understanding of it has deepened in the same way that our understanding of the night sky has deepened. And I see this as this idea of, well, so let's take Newtonian physics. The constraints were satisfied within Newtonian physics, and you could use the theory of gravity to solve problems and even send spaceships into space, but maybe not send spaceships into space, but you could use it to follow trajectories and look at the movement of planets, except for, what was it, Mercury. They could never figure out Mercury. That meant that there was some piece that was unknown, and because there was that unknown piece, they had to look for a new paradigm. And so when Einstein came along, it created a new, larger boundary, and that larger boundary opened up this whole arena of unknown into which, we now know all these layers of quantum physics filter out into this larger unknown area. Those unknowns give us more of an opportunity for optimization rather than just constraint satisfaction. And I spilled out way too much stuff there. But I do think there's something about this picture of the night sky, what they used to think they saw there and what we can see now through a telescope. Well, actually what we can see through the Hubble telescope flying through space is two different worlds, but it's the same world with a deeper understanding.
Here's an interesting thing about what you were saying. Just a question. Why, we have better quantitative measures of the extent of our own ignorance of the universe we live in, right? As you were pointing out, like we now know that a bunch of these stars aren't actually stars, but whole galaxies that we don't have the time or the resources to go explore, or, so we have this greater quantitative measurement of all the things we don't know. And yet we somehow this hasn't produced humility in us.
Exactly.
Right. Like it's led to this even greater sense of certainty about more and more microscopic bits of details about this theory or that. And it hasn't produced the sort of wonder that you could say an ancient person had looking at the night sky.
Yeah, it's actually taken the wonder out of it, hasn't it? Actually desiccated it.
Yeah.
For some scientists, it's actually removed all the sense of wonder.
Right. And how it's funny because we are embodied creatures, right? And so I think probably a lot of science is no longer done in an embodied way, right? Where you're an astrophysicist and you even actually look at the night sky. You just get some data back in a spreadsheet from some, radio telescope that tells you some, measurements from this particular quadrant of the sky that you have some particular interest in, and you're like, you run some math against it. But I do think it's certainly significant that, for most populations of the world, you can't even see the stars anymore unless like I went camping a couple of weekends ago. And one of the things I love about that is if you can get far, and it's harder and harder to do. I mean, it's so hard to find places where light pollution isn't so over the top that you can only see a handful of stars. But like when you go somewhere where you really can, you have low levels of light pollution, it's jaw dropping in terms of the sense of wonder you have interacting with that. And you could say that's probably been until like, 100, 150 years ago, that was the norm for everybody, right? For most of human history. And it does make you wonder that, what role something simple as not being able to see the stars has on our and our own sense of, humility.
That's, I think that wraps it up beautifully for now, Michael. I really think that's just like so smart, that we get better and better quantitative measures of the extent of our ignorance, and yet it does not produce humility. I'm going to chew on that for a while. I'm looking forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, me too.
So maybe we can pursue DeFucci a little bit next time. So I'll go back and re-listen to your conversation with him.
Yeah, I'm absolutely convinced that Barfield's still exceptionally important to all these conversations. Probably even more so than DeFucci himself, because I don't know. I think that for him, that's a kind of a time slice of his life that he's moved past. And I don't think Barfield, like interacting with Barfield so much has even made me more aware of perhaps his deficiencies and the things he gets wrong and the kind of skewing of his perspective. But yeah, I still think there's a ton there. There's so much so many threads that come together in his work that, I think we'll be talking about him more in the future.
Well, I know one thing that I would like to talk about because I don't understand it very well, and that is, the way that Barfield's ideas would intersect with or reject or accept postmodernism, and how to tease those apart and to see where the negatives of postmodern. I mean, I know that there's some things about postmodernism that cannot be denied, but there are a lot of things about postmodernism that are quite dangerous. And to tease that apart and to figure out where Barfield fits in all of that would be very educational for me, because I don't know him as well as you. I don't know his work as well as you do. And I can easily get tangled up in that. And I know Carl, for one, is very concerned about the impact that postmodernism is having on just the stability of just the stability of civilization and the future of civilization. So I'd like to see if Barfield has anything to teach us about that.
Yeah, I think he does. And I mean, Barfield himself had those same concerns about what, and of course he focuses specifically on language, as kind of the thing he points to the most, but it's the same exact thing in terms of, yeah, he's concerned about, the stability of civilization. And, I don't know. It's interesting. It's weird because, the question that always comes into my mind is these really big questions when wrestling with Barfield. That's one of the reasons I like about him, because that's where my mind wants to go anyway. And I see so much of that resonating in the questions his work brings up. And one of those questions is like, where is the place for our agency, both individually and collectively, as the human race, with the decisions we're making now, in terms of the ways in which history turns out, and how does that interact with God's agency, his promises to bring this story to a good end. And I think there's a very complex interplay there. And I think Barfield, because he's so focused on the human side of the equation, he's very much In some sense, he reminds me a little bit of Peterson in terms of like, I'm going to stand from where I'm standing and tell you what I can observe from standing here, which he's very kind of rigorous around that. So he doesn't have the theological perspective on things, which is certainly a shortcoming of his perspective. But I think there, nevertheless, if we take that perspective and marry it with some theological language, I think there is quite a bit to learn and take away.
Well, I look forward to it. Let's tackle that as our topic next time around. And if there is a particular portion of Barfield that you'd like me to read in advance to prepare for that, I would greatly appreciate that. And also, you mentioned an app that helps you walk through the daily office. Could you send me the link for that?
Yeah.
I could put that in the show notes. And I'll also link to this blog on constraint, satisfaction, optimization, which explains it way better than I can, so that people will know what I was thinking about.
Sounds good.
Good seeing you, Michael. Have a great week.
Yeah. Same here. You too, Karen.
Next week. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.